Well, we're going to get started. With First of all, we'd like to thank our main team, which is really Sarah and Beth. Wonderful. So tonight we are pleased or very lucky to have Dr. Wilson, Professor of Civil Engineering at CSU. And the work has revolved around the issue of poverty and pollution and sort of the intersection between those two things. So that's what she's been talking about. That's about tonight. And I was to her now to get started.
Well, I'll use the lectern, but let me grab a few things.
So I'm really happy to be back. I was reflecting on the fact that it's almost been 3 years to the day that I got to speak with, I think some of you, there's a few familiar faces in the crowd beyond just my mother and my son who are also in the room. So the last time that I got to meet with you all about air quality and we're focused on air pollution. This time around, I'm not really going to talk a lot about my own research or work, but more broadly about the intersection of pollution and poverty. That was sort of the first half. And then the second half, roughly speaking, I want to shift to talking about something local, which would be how pollution in our home occurs, and then some issues that are really close to home. I do some work with the city of Fort Collins around rental housing. So I thought that might take a really big global problem and bring it down to a scale where you might even be able to walk out with something you could touch or feel or involve yourself in here in the city. But it is going to be interactive. I'm not here to perform. So although I'm not here in the front, I designed this. The handout you have in front of you, if you didn't get one, we have lots up front, is designed to get you to reflect on your own understanding of pollution, your own beliefs about pollution, talk with one another, and I'd really like to learn from you. So the way that I'm hoping to go through the questions that I have is to pose the questions, share a few of my own thoughts, and have you talk with a few neighbors, the people at your table, and then like a true tester, I would call on people, but I would take volunteers first. If there are no volunteers, I will point. I'd be happy to call on. But I'm hoping that it'll be both an opportunity for you to learn about yourself and what you think about pollution, but maybe encounter something novel or different or similar with your neighbors. So if you have the handout, I left mine. So if you want to take notes as you go of your own thoughts, or that not collecting this is not creating it. But I find it helpful when I'm thinking about something to write stuff down. So I want to start with actually what the word pollution brings to your mind. So I study how people are exposed to pollution. It's embedded in all of my projects. So I think about pollution every day. I'm an environmental engineer by training, but I do a lot of work with exposure scientists and health scientists. And so we're often thinking about how pollution impacts health. But that's not the only impact pollution has on the world, so I don't want to constrict your thought there. But I want you to think about what the word pollution brings to mind. Maybe write down a few notes for yourself first, and then start to share with your neighbors. Or you can think in your head, but what images come to mind if you're a visual person, what sounds come to mind, what examples come to mind, depending on where you're from, maybe encounter pollution different ways in your own life, or even living here in Fort Collins. So I'm going to let you think on that a little bit. I'll probably write a little bit. I can keep my notes. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to write down the last thought, and it might be a little bit, quick, but I wasn't here to watch you write, so I don't want you to think I was just trying to phone it in, but, I am curious, maybe starting on the right side, one thing that came to mind from the book, right? What was that?
We hear about it now in a lot of different ways, right? Because we experience the plastic bag ban, but there's also plastic pollution. I think people might be thinking about the microplastics. How many of you heard that term? Microplastics, micro just means very small, and so it's not like plastic that you use as a container, but it's what abrades as we make plastic products and it comes off plastic products. It's pretty pervasive. We hear about it arriving in places in the world where there are also people. So plastic pollution is pretty pervasive. How about the table up in the front here? The steel mills of Northwest Indiana. Being from the same place as you, that's also one of the first images that I have in my head. It's growing up on, not quite on Lake Michigan, but the National Lakeshore of Lake Michigan in Indiana and Illinois border has National Lakeshore, but the views on the National Lakeshore is a lot of the steel mill, which members of my family worked in. Smog in the air. So, yeah, some of the earliest like research on what's in the air that led to our Clean Air Act in 1970 was conducted through measurements in California. In addition to, I heard a group maybe mention acid rain. I don't know if that came up or maybe I made it up, but acid rain on the northeast side of the United States also pervaded some of our early regulation. Yes. Washington. Can you say a little more? Well, drinking water, whether it's close to home, or whether it's in rivers, or lakes, or brooks, there's so fish, lead deposits, mineral deposits involved. Water is a substance that carries many different contaminants from infectious disease that have been leading killer in places in the world where sources of water are not protected from bacterial and viral and infectious agents. And similarly, we see a lot of ecological degradation. Quality degrades. In fact, this is more of a natural, a natural symptom right now. We go out and see some anthropogenic origins of it, but
I learned that the Clear River this summer or fall has no fish or almost no fish in large stretches of the news. I'm not full disclosure, I'm not a virus. So environmental engineering faculty is 36 or 7 faculty. I'm the only one that sits here, so I am not responsible by this 3% of the water research, water quality work they do, which is really great stuff. But some of my colleagues on the effects of wildfire on water quality have been studied from all the way up in Rockwood National Park and State Forest State Park, all through the Poudre Canyon. Some of the impacts that the fires had on erosion, which then has led to ecological impacts on fish habitat, just to name one. So that's another great example of pollution. And actually, I'd like to maybe tag on to that, that water quality as a supply for humans is probably one of our greater success stories over the last century and a half. There's still people that are lacking access to clean water, but it got a lot of attention. And a whole host of people have been trying to tackle that issue for the last several decades. And the progress we've made from a sustainable development goal standpoint has been better for the water quality issues compared to some of the other goals that we've set. How about over here? Do you guys have anything you want to add in terms of pollution? Light pollution and noise pollution, thank you for bringing those up because we often talk about air and water and to a lesser extent, though equally as important as soil, but light air and noise pollution are issues that are getting more attention, and we're learning a lot more about the impacts it would have on habitat for creatures other than humans. And also in some major cities, noise pollution is one of the worst exposures that people are experiencing on top of the air pollution that they have. And in fact, in Colorado, the light pollution is sort of being addressed, maybe for aware the international dark sky areas that Colorado's trying to set up where improve. So a lot of the things that you all brought up, and maybe others that didn't get a chance to mention, are good examples of pollution. They can be examples that you think of as being very far away from you and not really impacting you. But pollution is really a matter of where humans intersect with the environment, thinking about it from a human health standpoint, and probably an event that most people experience here is when wildfires occur and the air quality in a place like Fort Collins is really heavily impacted. So when that happens, usually it's in the news, people talk about it because they're experiencing it, they can smell it, they can see it. And there are parts of the world where that's a pretty normal level of pollution still. So air pollution is one of the leading environmental health risk factors still. And there are places where we're seeing progress. There are also places where development and use of energy is still in competition with protecting human health, not on purpose, but because economic development does drive quality of life increase. So there's these really great plots that the World Health Organization publishes that shows that with increased energy use, there's an increased quality of life and well-being and ability to meet needs. Right now, because a lot of our energy resources come from fossil fuels, that also comes with pollution cost. And so I don't want to get too far off track. I really wanted to shift, and it's maybe a slight difference, but one that I want you to try to make me, which is what are a few of the beliefs you hold about pollution? This is different than I believe pollution comes in the air. I believe pollution comes in the water. That's what I'm looking for. I want you to talk with each other. So I think it helps to talk out loud with this one, especially. What are some beliefs you have about where it comes from, who's to blame, who experiences it, and see if you can find out in yourself one or two or three or four if you're working really quickly as a group, beliefs that you have about pollution. And then I'll probably go around and ask each of you for an example. So I wish you to be part of each of the conversations, and I know they're still ongoing, so that I think it. But, I really would like to know one or two beliefs, and for the rest of you in the room as you hear them, yeah, I think something that's really neat about being here with someone else believes is thinking about what would it mean to have that belief if it doesn't really match something you believe, or maybe it does match something you believe, and there's some resonance there. So understanding how somebody can their beliefs, if you have the same one, maybe it's through different pathways. So if you hear something that doesn't resonate with you, you know, maybe just reflect on it. I'm not going to comment very much, but I'm going to go through the text this way and see if you can give me two beliefs this time there that came up. There we go.
We talked a few different ways about how pollution disproportionately impacts problems
Yeah.
in the environmental justice kind of orientation.
Yeah, yeah, often. So just to make sure that we're hearing, so the first belief I'm hearing is that it's a problem caused by someone else that's greedier than me, that and not necessarily believing that I play a role in that. So that's might be a belief I see some other that's not around. And the other belief that you expressed is that there's a disproportionate distribution of burden that is associated with how people experience pollution. So is that fair? Then maybe this group in the front, if you have something, you can just propose two, or you can say we have the same beliefs done in a slightly different way. So don't just be like, yeah, what they said, that's not okay.
Well. No, that's right. And that's something that we discussed. How some people can escape effects of pollution, we can't. Socioeconomic factors that influence pollution. And we also talked about things like causes of pollution, CO2, that sort of thing.
So one being, I like what you added though, that in addition to like the burden is disproportionate. Sometimes that's because people that don't want to experience it have more mobility, whether that's geographic mobility, they can move. I know that you mentioned, but also just the socioeconomic position can allow you to create a buffer, whether that's by moving or, tightening your home so outdoor air pollution doesn't come in. There's a number of different ways you can avoid exposure that are not within reach for people who don't have means. But then the other, can you say a little more what you mean about like causes?
Well, the thing that came to mind, one of the beliefs that I hold about pollution, it's tailpipes. And I have 3 sets of tailpipes. If you think about when I turn that engine on, it's coming up the tailpipe, and all the thousands, tens of thousands of other tailpipes in the area. That can contribute to pollution.
Yeah, so that's a belief about maybe sort of correlated to the one that your table mentioned, that we do play a role. Believe that something that I do is pollution and not have to deal with that in some way. Can I ask this table? Yeah. Yeah, I like, so if I'm right, the belief there is that individual incremental action can, in aggregate, lead to some sort of change. That's a fundamental belief that influences how we behave on a day-to-day basis. Is there another one that you want to add?
What kind of like proposal for legislation could help the situation without looking at impacting, like companies that the legislation.
How can, I mean, can I rephrase and say, how can it be like mutually agreed upon legislation that doesn't significantly curtail business such that it leaves, right? And, at the same time addressing the impacts that might come with a certain set of industry. Yeah, that's a very tough tension to hold, which is that I like that you're bringing up how could we change things at a more systemic level. So we have a belief about individual level behavior and then a belief more about collective behavior, which you could argue it starts with where we go. In the back, no, back table. Is there anything you'd like to add? I know you're being last, so sorry.
Standing on.
Yeah, sure.
The carbon dioxide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in this country, that's that's a belief that is stating to demonstrate where you fall on that issue. It's not the case in every country the same, but that's a belief that is either held or not by large sections of our population. And a side story that I think is sort of interesting and for me was sort of a marker over time. I was at the University of Texas in Austin for my PhD for 6 years. PhD didn't take me 6 years. I did a master's. But in that time, I was a TA for a class that was an introduction to sustainability for incoming freshmen, and they could come from any discipline. But a large portion of the University of Texas undergraduate classes were from Texas. So when I started that class, we had an entire module, which is a couple weeks worth of material, simply around the belief whether CO2 was actually or not. And At the time, it was a minority position among students when I started, so that's 2007. By the time I finished, 2012, last time I taught or TA for that class, it was over the majority, so 50 to 60% that believed it was a pollutant, but didn't have any, like that was their starting assumption. So it's interesting to mark that over time, and you know, I've talked to a professor that continues to teach that class, and it's changed even more dramatically. That's in a specific slice of the population, which is you know, students who are able to go to a four-year institution in a big city that's expensive to live in. So don't necessarily ever extrapolate from Austin to the rest of Texas. Any of you who are from Texas are probably going to send me out of here right now. But I think it's an interesting belief to state because it's had different reactions even in the short period of time that I've been in this field. Is there any other beliefs on that table that you want to share? Well, thank you for reflecting on what you believe about pollution. I think it, you know, my hope is that you sort of take that interrogation out into the world as you encounter information about pollution. Something that I can't address here about too long is how do you find out information about something you don't know very much about? Where do you get information that you can trust? That's not a topic I was able to dive into today, but it's there's a lot of information out there about pollution. Not all of it has, you know, has the same quality, unfortunately. So, in some ways, I think that's one of the roles that I am lucky to play is that I get to think about it every day and interrogate information that I learn about the subject to try to evaluate its quality and contribute to that scholarly work. So, in the interest of time, the next question is around who does pollution impact? Since it sort of came up in a few conversations, I'm just going to make a few comments there and see if we can move on to the next question so that we can get to the next topic, which is housing that I was hoping to get to tonight. So it came up, the topic of environmental justice. I know this is something that I think a large group of you have been thinking about and encountering as a topic through your work as a congregation and through your sense of community. Environmental justice is a topic that can mean many different things to different people, but the US EPA funds some of the work that I do on that topic, and the National Institutes of Health that also funds some environmental justice work that we do in my group would more or less consider environmental justice issues or communities to be those that are adversely impacted by pollution, that they aren't the root cause of, and they bear the burden of pollution more intensely, maybe more frequently, maybe at critical windows of life and development than their peers in this in the United States, predominantly Black and then Hispanic groups experience far worse pollution, and to a lesser extent other minority groups. But race is where we see the greatest disparities in pollution exposure. We do also see disparities based on class. So it comes up a lot of times with environmental justice topics of like, well, is it really a race issue or is it just an economic position? And there's been actually an abundant amount on this topic in the last couple of decades to establish that in the United States, the burdens of pollution fall disproportionately on Blacks, also on people of color. So that's a slightly different environment to work in than, say, if you look at pollution and the experience of pollution by the poor globally. So I think it's important to distinguish between issues that are domestic and those that are global, especially when you encounter information about pollution burden. In the United States, a lot of our the primary reason that we see those pollution distributions being so unjust and so different for Blacks is because of redlining. It's a very clear history. It's not the only reason, but redlining has created communities geographically that then are situated closer to pollution and closer to where development, since those geographic boundaries were put in place, we have continued to add more pollution sources to those places. And so our history of redlining is what is the thread that communicates how we understand modern disproportionate burdens of exposure. So for instance, Black children at the same socioeconomic position have 2 to 3 times the rates of asthma as their white counterparts, regardless of socioeconomic rank. And that's largely because of the housing stock that they are able to live in, where it puts them relative to outdoor air pollution and the type of homes that they live in and the sources of pollution that are in those homes. So that's just one example, but there are unfortunately, I would say, many others. And so the racial disparities around pollution exposure in the United States, and then there are also socioeconomic disparities, and those are somewhat separate and sort of given what you were talking about a bit earlier with others, that pollution is not always within our control where it comes from, and so our ability to protect ourselves from pollution might be in our choice of occupation, might be in our commute, might be in the things that we are able to bring into our home to protect us, or the things that we choose not to bring into our home that would be harmful to us. So something that I work in a section of the Colfax corridor is in Denver. I don't know if people know you see the sign for like exiting on Colfax, maybe if you haven't been on it, but Colfax corridor is very long. It is not the same whole length. There is a pretty long stretch where a number of hotels that used to be there, for people, mostly for tourists coming through, have become residential hotels for people who are very insecure in their housing. And so they live in those hotels as long as they can pay, which might be a couple of days, a couple of weeks, maybe a couple months. And that area was sending kids to the ER so frequently for asthma that Children's Hospital asked for an environmental assessment of housing stuff, because they more or less were saying we can't medicate, and or we can medicate, but that's not solving the problem. We need to go look for what some of the other root issues are. Sorry, I said the time was myself. That's what I do now. But the reason I bring up those hotels is that they don't have a kitchen. They're meant to be a like hotel, so they don't even really have kitchenettes. So people bring in whatever they are going to use for cooking. And for some people, that's going to be like a little gas burner. In other cases, it could be an induction plate, but more often it's going to be something that's going to produce pollution in a room that was never designed to manage cooking. So without like going too deep dive, this is definitely what I study, which is like how people cook and heat in their home and how it produces pollution. So when you cook, even if you had an electric source for cooking, you're still producing stuff like that's what smells so good. You walk through it, it smells like onions. Like the onion smell is not bad for you, but there are lots of other things that come off that cooking. And so in a well-ventilated room with an exhaust hood, it's taking that pollution out of the house and not just blowing it back in your forehead. I don't know how many of you have, observed that if the vent is just coming here, it's not doing a lot. But in residential motels, there's no ventilation planned. But these motels have become places where people live and need to carry out all of the functions of the household, including cooking for their families. So pollution that we see in those places is largely cooking driven, and they bring in a gas, little stove that's producing quite a lot of nitrogen dioxide, which if you breathe that in, it can lead to asthma. It can also exacerbate existing respiratory conditions. And so that I tell that story because there are things you can bring into your home that make it worse for your exposures. There's also things you can bring into your home that improve or protect you against exposures, like a HEPA filter. Right? Throughout the COVID pandemic, I think people's exposure to learning HEPA filters has increased a bit. So the ability to buy a filter and bring that into your home and then replace the filter regularly is something that is not going to typically be within the budget of a lower income household. So I think of actions that protect us, but also actions that put us at greater harm. And typically in lower income households, they have both, detriments. They don't have access to things that protect them, and they also tend to have habits and behaviors that produce pollution because they're cheaper, easier to access, and unfortunately often produce pollution that they breathe in their home. I'm gonna go ahead and shift, to this last question. I apologize for skipping over. I have some additional material I can share, but I really did want to get to talk about housing before the night's over. So what I want to leave you with is I'd love for you to take this home and write down 3 questions for yourself. This is not for me, though. I certainly would love to hear from you and learn what your questions are. So you can contact me at any time. I'm really always keen to know what people are interested in. But it's really meant for you. I think the learning is to become more curious. So I'm hoping you have a few more questions. If there are any questions that you think I could, listen to and talk with you about, I'd be happy to do it. I did fear in my very future that I would run out of time. So I planned ahead. There's a couple of really great resources that are referenced at the bottom of this page where you can find out a lot more information than just this infographic, depending on your time and resources and depth of your curiosity on the subject. There's a Global Alliance on Health Inclusion. They produce some of these infographics. I would consider them a trusted resource. They're not a research agency themselves. They tend to curate. I think of them as like a gallery of research. Like, if a gallerist is collecting art to sell to people and curating collections, I think of the Global Alliance for Health Inclusion to be one of several curators online for information about pollution and health. The Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai on the left-hand side is some of the foremost researchers on pollution and health. And I will follow up with you and you can help me. There were 2 YouTube videos, one's 10 minutes, one's 3 minutes, and they're a summary of a report that was done in 2017 on pollution and health. They're a really nice summary. They're very digestible and accessible. You don't have to be a researcher to appreciate them. They are summarizing a commission that was conducted by the Lancet. So I don't know how many people are familiar with Lancet. Maybe then the Lancet is a very respected journal, now a set of journals that researchers like me, I don't publish in Lancet, but researchers who publish their work. It's a very high quality, one of the highest quality journals covering many different fields related to health. And so they had a commission on pollution and health and published a report that's in 2017. So it's, I would consider it fairly recent still. And the links to YouTube videos that I can share with you all just digest what's in that report. And these, the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution, and then of course the Lancet has additional resources, but they use some of those more dense resources to produce infographics like this first one on pollution, which is looking at pollution from a more global perspective than what we were talking about here tonight. And then the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution is also interested in, talking about a problem, but then suggesting what some current day solutions are. And you might see that, so a few things that came up, like funding enforcement activities, having regulations, so policy making came up, I think, over in the right-hand side here. Actions that can happen at the local scale to a more maybe national or regional scale. The other institute that I wanted to highlight here is Pure Earth, the Blacksmith Institute. They are another that, like I said, I can give them with our gallery managers, but for information on pollution and health. So Pure Earth was started by a number of engineers and health scientists who are interested in what solutions exist today. Like we don't need to wait for the perfect solution that can be deployed to all the people in the world. That's probably not going to happen all at once. Instead, there are some very valid solutions that aren't perfect. Like an example that comes up in the YouTube videos, a hydrologist who works in an area that's been super heavily impacted by lead exposures and smelters. And this is in a, I cannot remember the country, I apologize. It's not in the United States, so it is somewhere outside the US where there's been a lot of smeltering that's led to lead being emitted into the air, and then it settles into the soil. And same as in the United States, we have lead exposures that come from the soil, but we have we are not continuing to produce that pollution that stopped several decades ago. But in this place, people live, their homes are on land that's completely contaminated with levels that are hundreds to thousands of times greater than what the US EPA would consider acceptable. And there are some known solutions laying down that's just like a soil fabric, covering it with clay-like soil, so it's forms a seal, and then covering that with dirt. And that's the kind of solutions that Pure is interested in. Please excuse the slight digression, but I want you to be aware of them if you're interested in learning more beyond just tonight. So with the time that we have about 20 minutes still. I kind of want to shift gears, like I said, to a more local issue that does intersect also with my work, but I won't be referencing like my own research here. But I would talk about the Williams program and the efficiency work program in the city of Fort Walton. These are two separate programs, but they're pretty enmeshed. They know just well they put together. For the last couple of years, we have been trying to tackle the issue of bringing solutions that exist for owner-occupied homes to renter-occupied homes. So the topic that I'm trying to get you to focus in on with me is thinking about homes that are occupied by people that don't have full control over that environment, which is going to be a rental type agreement. And depending on the relationship with the person that owns the property, you may have a lot of say in what happens, but in a lot of cases, not just here in Fort Collins, but throughout the United States, where 45% of people rent. The people that are living in those homes can't necessarily control how that home is managed, including how pollution in that home is managed. So if you're more curious about what kind of pollutants are in the home and how you protect against them, I'd be happy to talk afterwards, but that's not really what I wanted to do here. I wanted to get down to a specific topic and then leave you with a news article that came out in late August here in Colorado. So I want to start though, higher level. I want you to, like before, talk with your neighbors and come up with 3 or 4 statements about what makes a home healthy. When I say it, I live in a healthy home, or I don't live in a healthy home. What are we saying? What does it mean? And I can just tell you if nobody agrees on that. So if you find that you're not coming to agreement, then you're right at home. So we'll start with what makes a home healthy. And then the next question you can see is what makes a home comfortable. What makes a home healthy? See if you can come up with a few statements or phrases.
Done.
Yeah. Guess I need to borrow one. There we go.
Okay, I've heard a lot of things that land on the list of healthy homes, so, can I start maybe that? Can you give me one thing that's, I know that we're going to talk about, but one thing that's associated with a healthy home? Again. Yeah, but then. Yes. So the key there is ventilation. So a healthy home, otherwise if there's not full agreement, there's not agreement on how to achieve. There is, I should say, more agreement on what are the dimensions of a healthy home. The National Center for Healthy Housing has a list of principles. There's 8 of them. If you are interested, that's a great resource for learning about healthy housing. Ventilation and keeping it ventilated is important. But I love what you just said. I teach this to my students every spring in our display engineering class that if you would like to make a major breakthrough as an engineer, a key win would be silent ventilation of the stove, because the number of studies that I've done are like, do you have a fan? Yes. Do you use it? No. Why? It's noisy. It's like 80% of people in every study I've ever done, including myself, I'm like, I'm gonna turn that on. Super loud. That's one of the what you touched on right there is so perfect though, because it's a desire for a whole home to be ventilated. It can be achieved through technology, but unless we build that technology to be people centric, it will never get used. And so there's a litany of examples in civil and environmental engineering where good technologies were designed without the people using them in mind. And I would like to think that we are shifting out of that type of design thinking into more human-centered design thinking, but I like that example a lot. On the right-hand side, I think you can see the vibrant conversation going on here. What are a couple here helping homes?
One of the things that was had with ventilation. Vents that are less noisy and they're coming on the market, they're rehab and they're still noisy, but less and more efficient. We talk about the pipes, make sure that we're not drinking water from the pipes or the pipes leading to the house. Like paying filters in the house for dust and sometimes like if carpets are all gassy, if you have carpets in there, sometimes you get filters that will pick up that all gas.
Yeah, it is great, but I like, so in addition to ventilation, you brought up another topic, which is addressing sources by either removing them, like you don't have them, or capturing what's coming up. So you talked about the emissions that come from carpet and the vacuum from the carpet, and there are some technologies that are able to remove those. They are generally out of reach of the average home, and so that's where I think there's often, good debate around, well, we would like everybody to have the same set of choices maybe in terms of what they bring into their home, but if it's going to bring something into their home that they can't afford correcting through the pollution problem, would it be better to reduce the choice set. And then that's an issue of who's in control of what that choice set is, that I think there's not a clear answer to me, who gets to be in charge of that. So you touched on another issue beyond relation to source control. In the middle, you guys have anything that came up that hasn't come up already? Yeah, so overcrowding, which is a really interesting, has an interesting history, because it's probably one of the main reasons we ever started thinking about the indoor environment as a source of pollution in the first place. Homes that were, housing people that were passing through, or workers, were significantly overcrowded. That is housing development's first standards for habitability, which had to do with occupancy, because the more people you put in a space, the more likely you get passing of infectious diseases, which we're very well aware of through the COVID pandemic, but also increased levels of carbon dioxide, which can be harmful at the levels that we see. In fact, in one of our studies, we put measurements expressly in the bedroom, because we've been interested in how different is bedroom air quality from the rest of the home, and we're finding it's quite different, which is insightful for us, because usually we only put one sensor in a home that is going to represent the air, because we don't have enough funding to support 5 or 6. So this project that the city of Fort Collins supported 5 to 6 sensors per home, which is really helpful. Now we're learning more about this environment where people spend about half their time at home is, potentially in the bedroom. So that's overcrowding is a separate issue. It's a source from ourselves. And then you guys have anything to add? Yeah, so how are we separating from our waste? And it's a good segue into the topic of habitability, which is always a shifting standard. In the United States, it's been fairly steady through the housing and urban development. They set standards of habitability, which means that the house isn't going to fall down. It's not going to catch on fire. And it has a floor. So you mentioned that having a floor, it has some management of waste and sewage. So the habitability standards are the bare minimum by, I would say, many Americans' expectation. But in other parts of the world, we would find homes, none of which would meet a standard of habitability in the United States. So in that's why I say it's still a relative term. The reason I bring it up here is that I want to highlight a few things with the last little bit of time that I have, which is that there is a warranty of habitability that homes must meet in order to be inhabited. Most people are not aware of this. It's not talked about very much by realtors or at points of sale, and it's definitely not like a common topic for a landlord to bring up with their would-be tenant, or for a tenant to know to ask about. Warranties of habitability are the low bar. So really, like I said, it's more about safety than it is about pollution exposure. However, it relates to this topic that I want to close on, which is rental registration and licensing. How many of you are aware of that topic being salient to the city council here in Fort Collins? Raise your hand. Anyone else aware of the topic? So rental registration simply means that every property that is rented in a municipality is registered. That is not the case in the city of Fort Collins. So I studied housing, and I wanted to study renter occupied versus owner occupied, and I came to learn that there's no way of knowing whether a property is rented or owned in the city of Fort Collins, because there's been a desire for people to not have to register their properties if they're renting them. And there's plenty of discussion on why people take that position. Rental registration has come up for city council for a long time, well before I arrived here. In fact, for today, I found this memo that Darren Attenborough wrote in 2004. The Word document was online. So I'm not bringing it out because I was like, I don't really know what context it was in, but the topic of rental registration has come up as like, how much of a issue does the city council want to take it on? You know, do they want to deal with it as a high priority issue or a low priority or not at all? And the people that I work with have given me some background on the history. To date, there's still no rental registration, but there is a desire to understand whether the attitudes on rental registration are shifting in the city of Fort Collins. And I thought that might be something that you as a congregation might be interested in. I am not taking a position that I'm suggesting you should take. If you're interested in my position, I'm happy to share later. Rental registration is separate from licensing, and this is where I guess I was hoping to have you leave with this knowledge if you didn't already have it. So rental registration just says it's a rental property or it's not. You have to meet a warranty of habitability, which is that safety threshold, like it's not gonna burn down, it's not gonna fall down, but there is no expectation around health of the and so there's more comfort in more municipalities around the US for rental registration, except that it opens the door for rental licensing. And people who own properties and manage them tend to not want the license to be required. A license would then stipulate what the home has to be and how it has to continue being maintained over time. So in city of Boulder, they have a rental registration and licensing program, and their license stipulates certain features of the home that must be met, like it must have a CO monitor, which many homes, you know, do have, but it has many other expectations, and suffers from enforcement. So there are many examples. Maybe you have friends or colleagues or you know, I don't know, children who live in Boulder in rental properties that are not meeting that license. I have a number of colleagues and friends who can give me lots of examples of properties that are not meeting that. So a license doesn't mean that all the homes are then suddenly at that quality, but it puts in place a structure for maintaining the quality of homes for people that don't have control and whose tenure in that might be short-lived. So I wanted you to be aware of that issue, because if you're thinking about, you know, what can I do to influence people's reduction of their exposure to pollution? A lot of our exposure to pollution comes through our home because we spend, you know, 70 to 80%. For some people that are less mobile, 90, 95% of their time is in their home. If that home is not well ventilated, if it has many sources of pollution, then that exposure is almost all the time they're there. And to address some of those pollution issues, knowing about our housing stock, whether it's through rental registration and licensing program, or simply you know, more informal efforts to know about the quality of our housing stock, that offers an opportunity to make changes at no cost, low cost, higher cost. There's a sliding scale solution in terms of the investments, and I think that's maybe where I would close with, is that knowing more about the places that we live and work, and the quality of the environment is part of the problem, but also then understanding who's in control of that environment. And rented housing is an example where it impacts a large number of people that don't necessarily control of the environment. And I think some of you, or maybe all of you, have read Evicted. So that book is much more focused on housing insecurity, but it's the same population, which is a group of people who rarely have agency over where they're going to live, how long they're going to live there, and what I'm talking about is the quality of the home that they're going to live in. So I will close there. I think that's about it. And I don't know if the plan is to I can take questions and we didn't know about in chat. Yeah.
What percentage of properties or rentals?
It is about similar to the national average. It's about I want to say 40%, but again, that's an imprecise. Oh yeah, that's an imprecise estimate because we don't have registration, so the city doesn't know precisely what that number is. One thing that we do know is that I think what we use as a common like statistic was that about 95% of the people in Fort Collins that are below median household income
or so low LMI, low middle income households, 90 to 95% of those households rent. So most of the people that are low resourced in Fort Collins are also renting, and therefore I would say are low agency to make a change in an environment that they spend a lot of time in, and their children spend a lot of time in. So I'm highly motivated to learn more about rental housing in Fort Collins because I think that's where we have the greatest potential to improve people's environments. But it turned out to be a tougher issue to tackle than I realized when I first arrived in Fort Collins. It's like, oh, where's the list? We don't have that. So, sorry, I'm a little slow. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, do I find the same issues in different places? Yes, so I would say that's a very common, like what you're describing is very common so if we use college towns as an example, then it's often a student population or a young professional population where we get issues of overcrowding because people are trying to make rent, so they triple the number of people and that the home was designed for. The homes are never maintained. There is no mandate to maintain them because the person that manages the property knows that if you decide to leave, I have no problem backfilling. You actually bring up a really interesting population that I feel a little bit ashamed that I didn't think of this ahead, beforehand, and kind of be sort of to learn the hard way, I feel. But working with the city, they have this program for energy efficiency upgrades that largely owner-occupied middle-income households have taken advantage of. They wanted lower middle-income households to have access to those same programs. But we excluded students because we felt like they were a separate type of population, and we really wanted to address residents who lived and worked here for the long haul. And I think my opinion on that as an exclusion criteria has changed. Students are always a part of this community. They're always a part of communities where there are colleges, and they are usually expected to just tolerate whatever the living conditions are. Places that I lived in, I remember being like, yeah, well, this is just what I live with because I'm a student. And yet, it's a critical window of their time, especially for reproductive health and brain development that's still going on for, upper teenage to mid 20-year-old people. So that's a population that's been overlooked, and older people who are living in their homes and staying in their homes because they're less mobile. That's another population that tends to, because their household may have shrunk in size, so they may also be targeting similar types of housing that students would. They may not have as much of the overcrowding, but they have more of the safety issues. That pops up often. And there's a stat that I think is really helpful, which is that 85% of our 2030 housing stock has already been built. So we can think about changing new construction and building homes better, which I think is important. But most of the homes that people who live in the United States have already been built. And so the bigger challenge is how do you affect change in those homes? And it's much harder. It's a lot easier to start from a blank page. I can speak a little bit about radon. It's not actually one of the topics a colleague of mine, Francisco, he's at the Energy Institute, works at CSU like me. We work together on a few projects. He has a number of projects with the state of Colorado and then also with the city of Fort Collins to address radon and really try to characterize it better, because the way it's been measured is through a lot of short-term measurements. If you're familiar with like the Home Depot test, it's like a couple days and you ship it off. Turns out radon is a lot more variable. So that 2-day snapshot, and I get this from Paul, so it's not my area, but he has said that measurement is not very useful because we really need longer term measurements. And so making radon measurements more of a regular part of maintaining your home would help us understand what the range of concentrations would be in a given home. so that a landlord could show a renter, like, this is what it's been for the last year, here's what I'm doing to address that issue. The other thing I wanted to mention on that is there was an ordinance in 2006, which you might be aware of, that requires, it's called radon resistant new construction. So any home built after 2006 must have the infrastructure for radon mitigation. There's a difference between active and passive. So radon comes from the ground, and it's largely a problem for basement apartments or basement dwelling, and then like ground floor. Above ground floor, we see a drop off in the concentrations. It's not as much of a concern. So the way to mitigate it though is quite approachable. You put a pipe down in the basement, and the radon gas goes out. Right, so you have a radon fan, that thing kicks on every hour or so and actively pressurizes the space where it's coming from. And the active pressurization is a really important step. So what the ordinance says, you have to have the infrastructure in place so that all you have to do is put in a fan. That was a compromise there were some people that wanted it to be active, and some that wanted none, so the passive mitigation is what was agreed on. And that is affecting housing stock in a positive way in my view. It's should be reducing radon concentration, but I don't know a whole lot more about the topic than that.
Next week, we are going to look at our Native American population. We have someone coming to that work, both on reservations and off reservations. And as a plug for Evicted, which Miriam will be leading the book study next Tuesday night at 6:30 or Wednesday morning at 9:30. And having just reread that book, the whole issue of habitability of the housing of these inner city Milwaukee families that the author follows is front and center in that book. So we'd like to come join us for that. So let's take a moment. We'll close with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for the information that we have learned tonight. Help us to know how to use it to be your hands and feet in the world. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thank you so much. That we very much appreciate it.